Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast. Now, if something sounds a bit weird, that's because I am not Jack. This is Eric Halsey, the host of the Bulgarian History Podcast. Now, if you've been enjoying this deep dive into the history of the Steppe and the Turkic peoples and their migrations and such, then I highly recommend you check out the Bulgarian History Podcast to find out a lot more about one of those tribes, the Bulgars, and what their history has been all the way from the 4th and 5th century to, currently we're in 1887. So for a lot more history and a lot more about Bulgaria, check out the Bulgarian History Podcast. And now back to the show.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire. Episode 14, The Bulgars in the Western Steppe. In Episode 13, we talked about the First Turk Empire, which united the steppe from the east to the west. But Turkic groups had begun moving west before the empire was conquered. Much remains unclear about who these people were, where they came from, and what happened to them. At this early stage, they were still illiterate, and therefore we have to rely on Byzantine and Persian reports, which do not always clearly distinguish between different groups, or sometimes use names just once with confusing attributions. One of the groups that eventually emerged out of the confusion to become a power in the Pontic-Caspian steppe was the Bulgars, who you may also see referred to as the Bulgars with a GH, the Bulgari, the Bulgars with an O instead of a U, or Bulgars with an O and an H. These are all the same people. The fact is that Turkic does not map particularly well to English, so in addition to uncertainty over who is being referred to where, there are usually several variants for representing each name in English. It's fair to say that we do not have an absolute consensus on the origins of the Bulgars, and the various populations claiming descent from them have also had differing opinions about the subject over the years. As this is the Russian Empire History Podcast, I'm going to follow the Turkic origin position, which is most common in the Russian and Tatar historiography, but I'll mention some of the other theories as well. I'll also just note that there is not a complete consensus on who exactly are the descendants of the Bulgars. Some peoples claim to be their cultural heirs, while claiming that actual genetic descent is irrelevant. But that is a subject I will address later on when we are looking at the Volga Tatars. Podcast footnote. Some of you are sure to wonder when the Bulgars began to identify as Tatars. Although Russians and other neighbouring peoples began using Tatar to refer to all the non-Slavs associated with the Golden Horde, Bulgar continued to be used in self-identification on the Volga, especially in rural areas, until well into the 18th century. End of footnote. The Turkic origin theory naturally starts with the Bulgars as steppe nomads. In the Middle Ages, writers such as England's Roger Bacon and William of Rubruck, the Dutch missionary to the Mongols, who has already come up in previous episodes, believed that they had come from the Bulgars on the Volga, which is, of course, putting the cart before the horse. Later Western European historians, in the 17th and 18th centuries, thought that the Bulgarians came from Sarmatia or Scythia. In the 18th century, Philip von Strahlenberg a geographer serving in the Swedish army, was captured by the victorious Russians at Poltava and sent as a prisoner of war to Tobolsk, a town in Siberia. He developed a strong interest in the region and the non-Slavic peoples of eastern Russia, eventually writing a Kalmyk German dictionary and a 2-volume work titled A Historical Description of the Russian Empire. Mixing up cause and effect, he thought that the Bulgarians got their name from the river Volga and the city of Bulgar, near modern Kazan. But his work became quite widely read and influential. In the second half of the 18th century, the Bulgars began to be linked to the Tatars more strongly, and thus to the Turkic peoples in general. By the 19th century, German scholars were linking the Bulgarians to Attila and the European Huns, and the idea of Danube Bulgarians as Slavicized Turks who had taken up a Slavic language as a result of adopting Christianity also developed. 1869 saw the discovery of the Nominalia of the Bulgarian Khans, a brief text listing early Bulgar rulers and their clans. The Nominalia also links the first rulers of the Bulgars to the Huns, but more importantly, although written in Old Slavonic, it contains a number of Turkic words relating to the clans and a steppe dating system. It was noted that the terms used were similar to the Chuvash language. The re-establishment of Bulgaria and the rise of Tatar national consciousness in the 19th century influenced views of Bulgar origins for several decades, as Bulgar origins became a political issue for the new state, and then along came communism. While Bulgarian patriots had adopted the Hunnic origin of the Bulgars, with Volume 1 of Vasil Zlatarsky's History of Bulgaria in the Middle Ages being titled The Age of Hunnic Bulgarian Domination, the communists dismissed this as class-based reaction. Instead, they followed the prevailing at the time Russian opinion that the Bulgars had Sarmatian origins. That idea did not stick around for long, though. In 1950, Stalin himself, an expert in history as much as every other subject, waded into the controversy, declaring that the theory of Sarmatian origin was the reactionary error, and the Bulgarians were in fact Turks. These days, we have of course moved past such unwanted interference into a world free of prejudice and bias, where we can objectively assess where the Bulgars really came from. At least, maybe we could if we had better sources. They seem to have been related to the Kutrigurs and Utigurs, other Turkic peoples who had already moved west, and the Byzantines also associated them with the name Onagur. One theory for the origin of the name is that it derives from the Proto-Turkic root for to mix, acquired because they were originally a mix of Turkic, Iranic, and other peoples. An alternative theory is that it derives from the word for rebels or troublemakers, which seems like a good match for nomadic raiders. As we have seen in previous cases, and will see again, their migration to the west was triggered by trouble with other steppe peoples. In this case, the Huns were probably the culprits. According to Priscus, an Eastern Roman diplomat and writer, representatives of the Onagur, Ogur, and Sharagur arrived to see the emperor in Constantinople in 463. They claimed to have been driven out of their original home by the Sabias or Savias, who in turn had been moving west under attack from the Avars, who had been attacked by the Xiongnu. There are a number of other mentions by Byzantine writers, which are somewhat confused and hard to follow. Not only are several names used, Bulgars, Volgas, Onagurs, Onagundos, but there are also different waves of migration, various alliances and confederations and changes of alliance, and similarly to the classic use of Scythians to refer to anyone from the steppe, the Byzantines also went through a period of calling any kind of steppe cavalry forces they encountered Huns. As I mentioned, not all scholars believe the Bulgars were Turkic, or at least primarily Turkic, as one version of the meaning of the name may be mixed. A few have suggested that they were Ugrian, but that theory has not earned a lot of support. More have argued that they were Iranic, possibly descendants of the Wu Sun people in Central Asia, who had adopted a Turkic language. While earlier historians had thought that the Bulgars were related to the Sarmatians merely on the basis that they all came from the steppe, some modern historians have analysed the nominalia and also argued that the names of the Khans have an Iranic rather than Turkic origin. Petar Dobrev, a Bulgarian historian, has argued that the Bulgars were a completely Iranic and even agricultural people living in Bactria. According to this theory, the Bulgars were driven westwards by the Yuezhi when they moved into Central Asia to found the Kushan Empire. Opponents of this theory note that Zoroastrianism has a clearly traceable presence in Central Asia, going back to well before the Kushans, and Buddhism had already arrived there by the time of Alexander the Great as well. Yet there is no trace of either religion among the early Bulgarians. Societies that have adopted agriculture are also less likely to undertake large-scale migrations. Several other attempts have been made to argue that the Bulgarians originated as an Indo-European group in Central Asia, who either adopted a Turkic language before being driven west, or were ruled by a Turkic elite. But despite these controversies, the Turkic origin of the Bulgars remains the prevailing view, especially in Russia, where, unlike the Danube Bulgars, the Tatars, Chuvash, and other people who link themselves to the Bulgars continue to speak a Turkic language. So if we look at modern scholarship, it is considered likely that the Bulgars emerged as a distinct group in Kazakhstan in the 3rd century. Prominent Turkologist Peter Golden, a strict adherent to the Turkic origins of the Bulgars, believes that the first Turkic-speaking peoples were pushed into the areas dominated up to that point by Iranic groups, by the peoples that would become the European Huns. Along the way, they absorbed elements from those Iranic groups, including, in the case of the Bulgars, a better understanding of agriculture than the more purely nomadic steppe peoples. Numerous peoples are mentioned in Byzantine records from the time, some of which scholars have attempted to link to groups in the Chinese records, but most were swept up in the Hun wave and disappear. After the death of Attila and the breakup of the European Hun Empire, there is a power vacuum on the western steppe, and the Romans are severely weakened. So most of the records are naturally concerned with the various groups threatening Roman territory, and Byzantine efforts to form alliances or encourage them to fight among themselves. The Kutrigurs and Utigurs, who may have arrived in the same wave as the Bulgars but moved further west, are a good example. The Byzantine chronicles are a bit confused as to whether they are separate peoples or one people that split into two peoples when their king had two sons. Whatever the case, the Kutrigurs were making large-scale raids into Byzantine territory, so the Emperor Justinian bribed the Utigurs to attack them. The Utigurs defeated the Kutrigurs and the Kutrugurs signed up as imperial allies, which caused some friction between the Byzantines and the Utigurs, who didn't understand why the Kutrugurs should be rewarded. In fact, the Kutrugurs did turn out to be completely unreliable, and they defected to the Avars. So Justinian hired the Utigurs to fight them again. The heavy losses caused by this fighting depleted both peoples to the extent that they lost their independence. Some migrated to Pannonia with the Avars. Some remained in the Pontic steppe and came under Turk and then Bulgar dominance. This post-Hun period lasts for about 150 years. From the first mention of Bulgar migrations into Armenia and the Pontic Caspian steppe in the late 400s, until Kubrat establishes Old Great Bulgaria in around 632. There are numerous mentions of the Bulgars in Armenian and Byzantine sources over this period, but constructing a clear picture of who they were and what they did is complicated by the various names used, changing alliances and migrations. Paul the Deacon, a Benedictine monk who wrote a history of the Lombards in the late 700s, says that the Vulgaris killed King Agilmund of the Lombards in the Carpathians at the beginning of the 5th century. But other sources say it was the Huns, Avars, or Bulgars allied with the Huns. The killing resulted in the Lombards taking revenge on the Bulgars and turning the defeated tribes into vassals, after which they migrated into northern Italy with the Lombards. But a few decades later, the Bulgars crop up again, when they agree to fight the Thracian Goths for Byzantine Emperor Zeno. Although defeated, 5 years later they are back, fighting the Goths as Byzantine allies, and when Theodoric the Great takes the Ostrogoths off to Italy, he leaves Illyricum and Thrace open to Bulgar raiding. With land open for the taking, the Bulgars apparently abandoned their alliance with Byzantium, defeating armies led by the Roman Supreme Commander in 493 and 499. 30 years later, they were raiding the region again, and again defeating Roman armies. But the Byzantine military recovery under Justinian the Great reversed the trend. After a new alliance, this time with the Goths on Constantinople's side, the Bulgars were defeated with heavy losses in Thrace in 530 and on the Yantra, a river in the north of modern Bulgaria, in 535. In the mid-6th century, Roman historian Jordanus wrote that the Bulgars were living in the Pontic steppe, where one of the tribes, which he calls the Huniguri, most probably the Onagurs, controlled the marten fur trade. Marten pelts from the northern forest were a major commodity for centuries, often serving as a currency substitute. Control over the fur trade would become a major source of economic power at the intersection of the steppe and forest. Pseudo-Zacharias Rhetor, an author who compiled a history in Cyrillic in the late 6th century, describes the Bulgars as living beyond the Caspian Gates. That's modern Derbent in Dagestan, the southernmost city in Russia, guarding the strip between the Caspian and the Caucasus Mountains. He refers to the Burghers, believed to be the Bulgars, as pagan barbarians living in tents. His history refers to 13 tribes: the Onagur, the Sabir, Burgar, Kutrugurs, Vars, probably the Avars, Kasser, probably a Turkic group called the Akadziri, the Sharagur, the Dimir, who don't appear anywhere else, the Bagrasir, who are probably the Barsil, the Budl, probably the Abdali, and the Hephthalites. They dwell in tents, eat livestock, fish, and wild animals, and lived by plunder. In the mid-6th century, the Bulgars fade out of the records for a while. The Kubrats and the Utigurs return as the main Turkish tribes on the western steppe, and it is at this point that Byzantium intrigues to get them to fight each other. The Bulgars return to the sources in connection with the Avar and Turk conquests, and are frequently linked to the Onogur. Nicephorus I refers to them as the Onogundurs, Theophanes as the Onogunda Bulgars, and Constantine VII says that the Bulgars used to be called the Onogundurs. There are similar terms in Armenian and Arab sources. Given the migrations and shifting alliances of the time, we will probably never know exactly who the Bulgars were at this time. One theory is that the Bulgars were a confederation of tribes, including the Onogurs, Utigurs, Kutrigurs and others, that had combined after suffering losses fighting each other, the Avars, the Turk, and the Byzantines. The fate of Old Great Bulgaria, which is where the Bulgarians really come into our story, might support that idea.
So, I hear you're doing a one-man history show.
That's right. Relevant History is a one-man podcast where I talk about all kinds of historical events. Did you know that a lot of people think the Ark of the Covenant still exists in Ethiopia?
I did not.
What about the Prophet Muhammad? Did you know he used to be a merchant sailor who traveled at least as far as India?
I had no clue.
That's why you should listen to Relevant History. It's a one-man podcast where I take a deep dive into all kinds of historical events. The first season is about the idea of nationalism and how different societies formed their sense of national identity.
What if I want to be a part of the show? Is this a lecture?
You can't. It's a one-man show. But if you want to listen, you can find the podcast at dantollerpodcast.com. That's Dan, T-O-L-E-R podcast.com. Or you can search for Relevant History on any major streaming platform.
I like that.
Old Great Bulgaria, created in 635, is an anachronistic name given by Byzantine chroniclers after the formation of Danube Bulgaria. Peter Golden says it would better be called Onogunda Bulgaria, and Hyun Jung Kim sees it as a confederation of the last vestiges of tribes who had been in the Western Hunnic Empire before they succumbed to the Turk. The leader of the Bulgars, Kubrat or Kuvrat, had spent time in Constantinople, where he was cultivated by the Emperor Heraclius with a view to using the Bulgars against the Sasanian-Persian alliance with the Avars. Kubrat, which derives from the Turkic word for to gather, and may be an honorific rather than a personal name, took the title of Khan and led the Bulgars in a revolt against the Avars in 631. The Avars won and drove the Bulgars out of the Carpathians, but the Bulgars had achieved independence, and the Avars lost control of the Pontic steppe. Kubrat united the Onogur Bulgars, Kutrigurs and Utigurs into a confederation ruling from the Dniester to the Volga. Phanagoria, on the Taman Peninsula, one of the old Greek cities I hope you remember from the episode on the Bosporan Kingdom, became the capital. The Khanate was initially successful, fighting the Avars as the Byzantines had hoped, taking over their territory and shifting its centre closer to modern Poltava. The Bulgarians displaced the Avars from the dominant position in Pannonia, which acquired the name Hungary by derivation from Onogur. Kubrat and the other rulers of Bulgaria were from a clan called the Dulo, who may be related to the Tulu, a clan in the Turk Confederacy, who may have rebelled against the Ashina as the Western Turk Empire declined. As well as whatever power they had among the steppe peoples, Kubrat also seems to have built a strong position with the Byzantines. As mentioned, he spent some time in Constantinople, and according to the Chronicle of John, Bishop of Nikiu, he was baptized and grew up in the imperial palace. Certainly, the Byzantines had plenty of reasons to bring the northern Black Sea region under their influence, but in this case, the success would be short-lived. Kubrat had 5 sons. According to legend, he instructed them to always be united so that their power might thrive. Of course, they ignored his advice. As soon as Kubrat was dead, his sons fell to squabbling. The tribes broke apart and were no longer able to resist their rivals, and old Great Bulgaria collapsed. Although it may have been the result of internal tensions within the Confederation, most scholars agree that the primary cause was that the Khazars were emerging from the turbulence in the Western Turk Empire to assert dominance on the Western Steppe. The Khazars would later say that they drove the Onagurs out of the Pontic steppe. Beyond that, we know very little about Old Great Bulgaria and the Bulgars. The Byzantine chronicles skip straight from its foundation to its fall. We know the Bulgars were mounted steppe warriors like other steppe peoples, but not how they were distinguished from other groups. We know little about their organization or to what extent they had central institutions. Despite several theories about their greater use of agriculture compared to other steppe contemporaries, we don't know how much they were settled or nomadic. In fact, we don't know very much for sure at all. So if all that seems like a confusing couple of centuries, it was. The Hun invasion of the West, culminating in Attila the Hun's destruction of the Western Roman armies and attack on Constantinople, where he extracted an enormous tribute, had left Rome depleted and weak. Unable to compete with steppe empires in the field, Constantinople relied on spies and diplomacy to persuade steppe peoples to fight each other or ally with the Romans against the others. Another factor was also playing an increasingly important role that made relations with the new steppe powers different to the days of the Scythians and Sarmatians. With Christianity now entrenched as the state religion of the empire, the steppe now took on another aspect, the origin of Gog and Magog, the enemies of the righteous at the final battle with Satan in the Book of Revelations. In the Byzantine worldview, the Danube was the boundary of the civilized world, and the people living between the Dnieper and the Dniester and on the Black Sea coast were a buffer between Christian civilization and godless evil. Equally, the nomads also looked on the sedentary empires as alien. The Romans and Chinese built walls to keep the barbarian invader out of their lands, but the nomads could do the same. The Bulgars built an earthen rampart 120 kilometers long from the Black Sea to the Maritsa River to mark a limit on the Byzantines. So the Bulgars and the Eastern Romans looked at each other as them and us, defining themselves by contrast: nomadic and sedentary, agricultural and pastoral, Christian and pagan. This was quite a normal state of affairs between neighbouring peoples at the time. We've encountered it already in this podcast, and it is going to come up again as we look at the development of the competing polities on the Eastern Plain. So what makes the Bulgars special? In this case, it is something outside of our story that happens with the Danube Bulgars. The steppe has something of a reputation for religious tolerance. It was not, as it is sometimes presented, the equivalent of a modern everyone is free to believe whatever they want type situation, but there was no centrally enforced religion. Missionaries travelled from the sedentary world to the grasslands with varying success. Large numbers converted to Christianity, Manichaeism, or Islam, but the leaders did not, and there is a fair amount of evidence that this was a considered policy, intended to maintain their distinctiveness from neighbouring powers. When steppe rulers converted, they chose a religion that would continue to distinguish them from their neighbours. A good example we have coming up soon will be the Khazars, who chose Judaism rather than Christianity or Islam. Kubrat had been baptized in Constantinople, and while old Great Bulgaria had remained pagan, the Danube Bulgars became the only people from the steppe to convert to Christianity. By this point, after moving to the Danube region, they had already assimilated to a large degree with local Slavs. And when political fighting in Moravia, the Central European Slavs around where the Czech Republic is today, resulted in their archbishop being driven out, he took refuge in the First Bulgarian Empire. That archbishop was Cyril, or Kirill to the Slavs, who together with Methodius had created the Glagolitic script for writing Slavic languages. In Bulgaria, Cyril and his disciple, Clement of Ohrid, created the Cyrillic alphabet on the basis of Glagolitic, simplifying it and making it closer to Greek. Although by this point the Pope had turned against the use of the Slavonic liturgy, Tsar Boris was still looking to maintain distinction from Byzantium and established academies to teach theology in Slavonic using Glagolitic and Cyrillic scripts. This made Bulgaria the first centre of literacy and Christian learning in the Slavic world. The Old Bulgarian language, as it is still called by Bulgarians, became known as Old Church Slavonic, which became something like Latin in Western Europe, a religious lingua franca spreading throughout the Balkans and north to Kiev and Poland. It is used as a liturgical language to this day by the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church, Serbian Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and the Macedonian Orthodox Church. The spread of Christianity spread the Cyrillic alphabet throughout the Slavic world and influenced the development of other Slavic languages. But as interesting as that story is, and as important as Cyrillic and Orthodox Christianity will be to the history of the Russian Empire, that's a subject for later, and not why I'm talking about the Bulgars today. Let's get back to Kubrat's sons. What happened when Old Great Bulgaria broke up? Two of Kubrat's sons, Bat-Bayan and Kotrak, remained in the Pontic steppe as Khazar vassals. Kubrat's third son was the one who led his people west to the Danube, where he founded the First Bulgarian Empire, the predecessor of modern Bulgaria. The fourth brother, Kuba, led a revolt against the Avars in Pannonia and subsequently moved to Macedonia. The final brother, Alchak, took his people into Italy, but they settled in the territory of Ravenna and became Roman citizens. Kotrag is the most important to our journey. If you think that his name sounds a bit like Kutrigor, one theory is that the people he led came from the Kutrigors absorbed into Bulgaria. While the part of the Bulgars who had adopted sedentary or semi-sedentary lifestyles remained in the Pontic steppe and were absorbed by the Khazars, the still nomadic Bulgars that he led decided to migrate northwards. Eventually they would reach, settle, and become the dominant force in the region where the Volga joins the Kama, where the steppe meets the forest. The journey would take them until the late 8th century, a time for which we have almost no written records, as they moved out of the area of interest to Byzantine chroniclers and have left no records of their own. But once they reached that region, where they founded Volga, Bulgaria, they would mingle with Finno-Ugric peoples and Proto-Slavs to become the predecessors of today's Tatars, a huge influence on other non-Slavic peoples in the region, Chuvash, Bashkirs, Maris, and eventually a rival power to the Rus. We will rejoin their story there, thankfully with increasingly better sources, in a few episodes' time. And with them, as we set the scene for the birth of the Russian Empire, two of our major players, the Khazars and the Bulgars, have arrived, and our story has finally fully come into contact with the forest, which makes it the perfect time to introduce another one of the main families of peoples of the Russian Empire, the Finno-Ugrics or Finno-Ugrians. Join me next time as we take a first look at the peoples of the northeastern forest. Thank you for listening. You heard clips in this show from the History of Bulgaria podcast, an excellent show about a country with a far more significant past than you might imagine, and Relevant History, a podcast investigating the origins of nationalism, an important subject for the history of anywhere. I listen to both, and I recommend them to you too. Check out the resource page on the RussianEmpireHistoryPodcast.com for further reading, and you can get in touch with me via the website, Twitter or Facebook, or email to hello@theRussianEmpireHistoryPodcast.com. Until next time, goodbye.